Good evening. Welcome to part 12 of our Middle-earth-inspired series. This is the second story in the Enchanted Forests, Forgotten Paths. Let's begin. The forest grew darker as the companions moved deeper into its heart, the faint glow of the guiding stones now barely visible beneath the encroaching roots and tangled underbrush. The trees around them towered higher, their trunks thick and gnarled, their bark etched with patterns that looked almost like ancient runes. Orlen felt the weight of the seed in his pocket, its warmth pulsing faintly as though alive, a quiet rhythm that matched the subdued hum of the forest. Cyrana led the group, the keeper's staff glowing faintly in her hand, its light steady but subdued, as if the forest's magic resisted its presence. Adric followed closely, his staff brushing against the ground with each step, the runes along its length shimmering faintly in the dim light. Calen trailed behind, his movements cautious, his gaze darting nervously to the shifting shadows that flickered at the edge of the path. The air was heavy and damp, carrying the faint scent of moss and earth, and the only sound was the soft crunch of their boots against the forest floor. The path ahead twisted unpredictably, narrowing into a corridor of intertwining roots that rose up to form natural archways. The light filtering through the canopy above grew weaker, shifting into hues of green and gold that cast eerie patterns on the ground. "This place feels different," Adric murmured, his voice low but clear in the oppressive silence, as if the forest itself is hiding something. Orlen glanced around, the shadows playing tricks on his eyes, shapes shifting and disappearing just beyond the edge of his vision. "It's alive," he said softly, his hand brushing against the ring in his pocket. "And it knows we're here." As they continued, the path seemed to fragment, splitting into several trails that twisted and turned out of sight. Cyrana halted abruptly, her gaze narrowing as she studied the diverging paths. "This wasn't here before," she said, her tone sharp but measured. Adric stepped forward, his staff glowing faintly as he examined the ground. "The forest is changing," he said thoughtfully, "shifting itself to confuse us, or to test us." Calen's face paled, his eyes darting nervously between the trails. "Great," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Another test." Orlen stepped closer to the nearest path, his hand resting on the rough bark of a tree that bordered it. The bark was warm beneath his fingers, and a faint whisper brushed against his thoughts, too fleeting to grasp, but leaving behind a sense of unease. "We need to choose," Cyrana said firmly, gripping the staff tighter. "But we need to choose carefully." The group hesitated, their eyes scanning the trails, each one disappearing into a wall of shadow and foliage. Orlen felt the seed in his pocket grow warmer, its pulse quickening slightly as though urging him forward. He stepped toward the center trail, its entrance framed by two massive trees whose roots intertwined like clasped hands. "This one," he said quietly, his voice filled with an unexpected certainty. Cyrana turned to him, her expression unreadable but sharp. "Why this one?" she asked. Orlen hesitated, his fingers brushing against the seed. "It feels right," he said finally, "like it's pulling us towards something." Adric studied him for a moment before nodding. "The forest reacts to the relics," he said. "If the seed is guiding you, it's worth trusting." Cyrana nodded curtly, her grip on the staff tightening as she stepped onto the trail. The others followed, their steps cautious but deliberate, the faint hum of the forest growing louder as they moved deeper into the twisting corridor. The air grew cooler, and the trees around them seemed to lean closer, their branches forming intricate patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Orlen felt the pulse of the seed grow stronger, its warmth spreading through him like a quiet reassurance. The path ahead curved sharply, and as they rounded the bend, the corridor opened into a wide clearing bathed in a strange silver light. At the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone altar, its surface covered in moss and vines that glowed faintly in the dim light. Surrounding the altar were several stone pillars, their surfaces etched with runes that shifted and shimmered as the companions approached. Cyrana stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she studied the altar. "This isn't just any part of the forest," she said quietly. "It's a memory, a fragment of something the forest wants us to see." Adric knelt beside one of the pillars, his fingers tracing the glowing runes. "The forest holds the past," he said thoughtfully, "but only pieces of it. This is one of them." Orlen approached the altar, the seed in his pocket pulsing steadily as though in recognition. The surface of the stone was smooth beneath the moss, its edges worn by time but still intact. As he placed a hand on the altar, a wave of warmth spread through him, and the air around them seemed to shimmer. The runes on the pillars flared brightly, their light casting long shadows across the clearing as a faint melody filled the air. Orlen felt his breath catch as the world around them blurred, the clearing dissolving into a vision of the past. The vision unfolded like a dream, the forest around them fading into a shifting haze of light and shadow. The companions stood frozen as the clearing transformed into a vast expanse of towering trees, their trunks gleaming like polished stone under a bright, golden sun. Figures moved among the trees, their forms slender and cloaked in flowing robes that shimmered with an ethereal light. Orlen felt his breath catch as he realized they were elves, not like those of Starhaven or Erendor, but older, their presence radiating a power and wisdom that seemed to resonate with the very earth beneath them. They moved purposefully, their hands raised in unison as they chanted in a language Orlen couldn't understand but felt echo deep within his mind. The runes on the stone pillars glowed brighter, their patterns weaving together into a flowing script that spiraled upward into the sky. One of the elves stepped forward, their form more defined than the others, their robes a deep green that blended seamlessly with the forest around them. They carried a staff of twisted wood, its surface etched with runes that pulsed faintly with golden light. The elf paused before the altar, their expressions solemn as they placed a small glowing object upon its surface, a seed identical to the one Orlen carried in his pocket. Orlen's fingers tightened around the seed as he felt its pulse align with the rhythm of the vision, its warmth spreading through him like a second heartbeat. "This is their memory," Adric said softly, his voice filled with awe. "A piece of what they left behind, preserved in the forest's magic." The elf began to speak, their voice low and melodic, carrying a weight that resonated through the vision. Though Orlen couldn't understand the words, their meaning seeped into his thoughts like water through stone. "The seed," Adric whispered, his gaze fixed on the glowing object on the altar. "It's the heart of the forest, its source of life and magic. They're binding it here, protecting it from the shadows." The vision shifted, the golden light dimming as a shadow crept across the clearing. The chanting grew louder, more urgent, and the runes on the pillars flared brightly, their light pushing back the encroaching darkness. Orlen felt a chill run through him as the shadow solidified, taking the form of a towering figure cloaked in darkness. Its presence was overwhelming, a suffocating weight that seemed to drain the light from the vision. The elves didn't falter, their voices rising as they raised their hands toward the shadow, their combined magic forming a barrier of golden light. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it pressed forward, its movements slow but relentless, its glowing eyes fixed on the altar. Orlen's chest tightened as the elf at the altar raised their staff, their voice ringing out like a bell. The light of the runes intensified, and the seed flared brightly, its glow blinding as it consumed the clearing. When the light faded, the vision was gone, and the companions stood once more in the clearing, the air heavy with the weight of what they had seen. The runes on the pillars were dim now, their light reduced to a faint glow that barely illuminated the altar. Orlen released the breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his hand trembling as he removed the seed from his pocket. Its light was steady but subdued, a quiet pulse that echoed the lingering hum of the forest. "They were protecting it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The seed. It's more than just the heart of the forest. It's their legacy." Cyrana stepped forward, her gaze sharp as she studied the altar. "And the shadows were after it," she said firmly. "They couldn't destroy the seed, so they destroyed the elves who protected it." Her grip on the keeper's staff tightened, the light of its crystal flaring briefly before dimming again. "Whatever's out there, it hasn't given up. It's still after the relics, and us." Calen shifted uneasily, his eyes darting to the shadows that flickered at the edges of the clearing. "If it's still out there," he said nervously, "then why hasn't it come for us yet?" Adric knelt beside one of the pillars, his fingers tracing the dim runes. "The forest has been protecting us," he said thoughtfully. "Its magic is old, but it's strong. As long as we're here, the shadows can't reach us." Orlen glanced at the seed in his hand, its warmth a quiet reassurance. "But we can't stay here forever," he said. "If the seed is the heart of the forest, then its power can't stay hidden. It has to be used for something." Cyrana nodded, her expression hard. "Then we take it with us," she said, "and we keep moving." The path ahead was unclear, the light of the glowing stones faint and sporadic as the forest shifted around them. The air grew cooler, and the hum of the forest deepened into a low, resonant tone that vibrated through the ground. Orlen slipped the seed back into his pocket, its pulse steady against his palm as the group began to move. The clearing faded behind them, the runes on the pillars dimming into darkness as the forest closed in around them once more. Whatever lay ahead, Orlen knew the seed would guide them, its light a reminder of the elves' sacrifice and the shadows they had yet to face. The forest pressed close as the companions moved forward, its towering trees swaying gently in an unseen wind. The light of the glowing stones that guided their path grew dimmer, flickering like dying embers, as if the forest itself was testing their resolve. Orlen felt the weight of the seed in his pocket, its pulse steady but faint, a quiet rhythm that seemed to echo the forest's hum. Cyrana led the way, her grip on the keeper's staff firm, its faint glow cutting through the dense shadows. Adric followed close behind, his staff glowing softly as he muttered to himself, his thoughts clearly consumed by the vision they had witnessed. Calen lingered at the rear, his eyes darting nervously to the flickering shadows that seemed to move just beyond the edge of the path. The air grew colder, carrying a metallic tang that prickled at their senses, and the silence was broken. Only by the crunch of leaves beneath their boots and the occasional creak of the ancient trees. The path began to narrow, the forest tightening around them as though it sought to corral them toward a single destination. Orlen's pulse quickened as the light of the stones ahead flared briefly, illuminating a clearing that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The trees around the clearing were taller and darker, their bark etched with runes that glowed faintly, casting eerie patterns on the ground. At the center of the clearing stood a massive stone monolith, its surface smooth and unbroken, its edges sharp and precise. The air around it was heavy, charged with a tension that made Orlen's chest tighten. "This wasn't here before," Cyrana said, her voice low but steady. Adric stepped closer, his staff trembling faintly in his grip as he examined the monolith. "It's a marker," he said thoughtfully. "A boundary, perhaps, or a warning." The runes on the trees seemed to brighten as he spoke, their patterns shifting subtly as though reacting to the group's presence. Orlen felt the seed in his pocket grow warmer, its pulse quickening as the air around them grew colder. "It feels alive," he said quietly, his voice tinged with unease. Cyrana approached the monolith cautiously, her grip on the keeper's staff tightening as she reached out to touch its surface. The moment her fingers brushed the stone, the ground beneath them trembled, and the runes on the trees flared brightly, their light flooding the clearing. The monolith began to shift, its surface rippling like water as a figure emerged from its depths. The figure was tall and cloaked in shadow, its form indistinct but undeniably humanoid. Its presence radiated a chilling malice that sent a shiver down Orlen's spine, and the air around it seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. "You carry the light of the keepers," the figure said, its voice a low, resonant whisper that echoed through the clearing. "But light is fleeting, and shadows endure." Cyrana stepped forward, the keeper's staff glowing brightly in her hand as she faced the figure. "We're not afraid of you," she said firmly. The figure tilted its head slightly, its shadowed form flickering as though caught in an unseen wind. "You should be," it said, "for the light you carry will not protect you forever." The runes on the trees flared again, their light blinding as the figure raised a hand, its shadow stretching toward the group like a living thing. Orlen felt the seed in his pocket burn with an intensity that made him gasp, and he instinctively pulled it out, its glow bright and steady in his trembling hand. The shadow recoiled slightly at the sight of the seed, its form flickering as the forest's hum deepened into a low, resonant tone. "The seed is the heart," the figure said, its voice quieter now but no less menacing. "But even hearts can be broken." Adric raised his staff, its light joining the glow of the keeper's staff as the companions stood together, their resolve unspoken but clear. "We're not here to fight," Adric said, his voice steady but firm. "But we won't let you take this from us." The figure's shadowy form flickered again, its edges dissolving into wisps of darkness that faded into the air. "The forest has spared you this time," it said, its voice distant and echoing. "But the shadows are patient, and they will find you again." The light of the runes dimmed and the monolith stilled, its surface once more smooth and unbroken. The clearing fell silent, the oppressive tension lifting as the air grew warmer. Cyrana lowered the keeper's staff, her expression hard as she turned to the group. "We need to move," she said. "This isn't over." Orlen slipped the seed back into his pocket, its pulse steady against his palm as the group began to leave the clearing. The path ahead was faint, the glowing stones barely visible in the growing darkness, but the companions moved forward with quiet determination. As they stepped into the forest, the air grew lighter, the faint hum of its magic returning as the trees swayed gently overhead. Orlen felt the weight of the seed more acutely now, its warmth a constant reminder of the burden they carried. The shadows had not been defeated. They had merely retreated, waiting for their next opportunity to strike. The companions' steps quickened, their resolve unshaken as they pressed deeper into the forest, their path uncertain but their purpose clear.